Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here to announce a new course from myself and Joshua Hansen. The course is on an introduction to Paul Virilio, the work of the late French philosopher of speed, as he's commonly known as, Paul Virilio. The course goes over 6 different themes on his work, from speed to space to emotional synchronization to aesthetics to accidents and catastrophes. Um, this course will be starting on the 1st of November. And you can find a link in the description to where you can sign up. I really hope many of you will sign up to this because this man's philosophy is so prescient to contemporary issues, whether they're to do with whether they're technological, political, psychological, and so forth. It's an incredible journey to go through this man's work and really think about the world we're in today through some of the most unique and original theories and perspectives that you could really come across. So here's a conversation with me and Joshua Hansen, to just give you an overview of the course and some of the themes and some of the reasons why one might want to take this course. Enjoy.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Joshua, and today I'm here with Owen. And today we're introing our course, Thinking at Light Speed, which is an introduction to Paul Virilio. Paul Virilio was a French architect, urbanist, cultural theorist. He wrote over 30 books, and he laid out some groundwork studies on themes such as warfare, speed, progress, aesthetics, and so on. He also created a number of museum exhibitions on these themes, and he is someone who is embedded right in the middle of the milieu of post 68 French philosophy, theory, and thought. For instance, he worked for Jacques Derrida. He worked with Deleuze and Guattari, Foucault. He basically worked in the arts. He also knew Matisse and others. And the claim is that the study of Virilio is quickly becoming essential for people that are trying to cultivate a strict realism about our contemporary state of affairs, in particular, stripped of a sort of naive techno utopianism that Virilio refers to as the propaganda of progress, and that is increasingly espoused from academic circles, particularly in the West. In any case, Virilio is one of the most prescient thinkers of the 20th century, to my mind, for sure. In my opinion, he is genuinely more important than many other heavily lauded thinkers, including Derrida, Heidegger, and basically that whole constellation of thinkers. And Virilio was certainly more accurate in his ultimate positions and the extent of his predictions than any other thinker of the 20th century, including a great deal of the overall scientific community, which is also another reason why, to some degree, he's been somewhat suppressed. He's experienced a bit of a decline and so forth. So basically, right off the bat, Virilio is known as like one of the foremost theorists of speed, and that's one of the themes he's associated with, especially since his first major text, Speed and Politics, was written, in the backdrop of May 68, and really how he originally came on the scene. And much of the rest of his thought sort of follows from Speed and Politics. So I'm going to bring in Owen, and, right off the bat, speed and politics, why is speed political?
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you. That's a good way to start. He's generally known as the philosopher of speed. To hear the phrase "speed is political" is sort of strange to hear at first. You kind of don't really understand how something like speed can be political. It seems like something which is just within the realm of mechanistic science. But I think that if we apply his theories to speed as he does himself, he's a very applied thinker, to warfare, but also to the information technologies and the advances in media, from writing to newspapers to radio, television to the internet. So if we start with warfare, I would put Virilio in the category of thinkers that are basically critical of what has been referred to as post-heroic warfare, a term that was coined during the Kosovo War because NATO managed to sort of militarily dominate in that conflict without incurring like one casualty. And so it's kind of post-heroic. And I think like drone strikes would be the ultimate result of this. And the only way that this kind of warfare is possible is because of speed, not only the speed of the Air Force or of projectiles, but also the speed which comes about through the informational technologies that are able to basically like GPS and map and track everything that is going on and kind of create this almost a network of constant and instant communication. This sort of technology makes warfare possible in a kind of hyper dominant way, which can avert any casualties. And if you can avert any casualties, you basically avert any conflict. There's no kind of battles which settle anything. There's no specific spatial zones because speed destroys space. There's no specific spatial zones where battles actually occur. And so it kind of engulfs the entire society into the battle because we're all using technologies which are potentially technologically kind of used not just for communication but also for potential warfare. So it kind of blurs the boundaries of war and it draws the civilians into the battle and it creates a very one-sided way of settling military conflicts where basically the technologically advanced societies can who are the kind of speed societies, as you might call them, are kind of hyper dominant. The second issue about speed is that, as Virilio will describe in The Administration of Fear, he will describe his life growing up in France under Nazi occupation. And he kind of takes note of the advances in communication and media technology, which are going on at the time, especially with radio and broadcast. He will note how occupation, physical occupation, military occupation is always coincides with a sort of mental preoccupation. With the advances in speed and the advances in informational technology, we not just have like physical events which are destructive of war, but we have kind of psychopolitical problems which emerge. One of those being that fear or aggression or emotions that are attached to threats. And it's not just warfare here. We should also think of natural catastrophes, viruses, as we've recently experienced, all sorts of emergencies, all sorts of things which are conducive to the state of emergency. These things no longer attach themselves to a specific object. They're sort of dispersed. Fear becomes environmental. Everything is like the threat is everywhere all the time because speed kind of eliminates spatial buffering and spatial boundaries and spatial distinction. So the things which threaten us are no longer in specific places, and like therefore it's very difficult to actually deal with these things because they're sort of environmental rather than at least not trapped, but at least inside a specific locality. So it creates this environment of fear for Virilio, which is kind of linked to the state of emergency. And so you have war, and I see what the second major category of speed in which its political nature is unraveling would probably be in the politics of media, politics of free speech, politics of misinformation and disinformation, which we're hearing about today. Speed creates distortions. Our perceptive capacity changes when things speed up, and this he refers to as the acceleration of reality. This is important when we're speaking of things like disinformation and misinformation, because as it currently stands, we have a sort of expert class who trying to conduct a sort of regulation of this infosphere, and they're sort of trying to create a kind of regulatory framework, and they're doing it in the usual technocratic way where it's not political. We're just controlling things which are lying. We're just fact checkers or whatever. But the problem with this is obviously not just that it's politically opportunistic, like we're going to pretend we're just fact checking, but we're actually going to do whatever in in our political interests and so on. There's always been censorship. There's always been regulation of speech. But it was once the case where, for example, things would be censored or blocked from communication because it was not conducive to national interest or because it was heresy against the church or something. But today, with the acceleration of reality, these experts are trying to determine what is real or not. They're not just trying to determine what is in national interest or good for the church, but they're literally trying to determine what is real, right? And because the problem is so technological and not simply about this opposing group versus that opposing group and so on, experts are basically trying to regulate what is real and what is not real from using the very tools and technologies which are distorting our reality to begin with. Like, they're not outside of the machine. Like, these experts and technocrats and so on are inside the machine, probably more so than anybody. How are they supposed to determine what is disinformation and misinformation, what is real and so forth? And I think we've recently lived through a crisis which has exemplified this exact issue perfectly, right? We have these systems of instant communication in which we can get all this data for COVID, for example, how many people are have the infection, how many people are dying, all sorts. It's kind of like a network of overstimulation of data. Quite obviously, none of this is conducive to actually knowing what the hell is going on, right? Which I think brings the larger point and kind of conducive to what you were saying earlier about the critique of a kind of techno-optimism. You have people like Habermas and these other media theorists in a more kind of like a communicative, rational deliberation that the internet is going to make us all much more rational, make things much more transparent. And I think the basic point of Virilio in his critique of the speed of communication distorts things so much that, and it also eliminates the buffering distances and the localities in which we actually understand information, because information is always pertaining to me in my world, right? It sort of distorts and despatializes and delocalizes everything so much that it doesn't lead to more transparency. It doesn't lead to more democracy. It actually leads to much more confusion, chaos, distortion, and potentially a sort of expert class that is, no longer just deciding what should and should not be said because of our national interest, but should and should not be said because it's not real or not, right? So a much more kind of epistemic politics nearly is emerging because of that. So those are two, I think, information and warfare. Those are, I think, the two biggest categories, the two most obvious categories where you can see how speed and politics are becoming intrinsic to each other.
Thanks. That's great. And, I definitely have seen, like, for instance, on Twitter, the rise of sort of these putative disinformation experts trying to occupy this, relatively new role that is a consequence, this sort of instantaneous interconnectivity associated with telecom and so forth. I'm going to move into another question here, which is, what does Virilio offer in his analysis of media that's sort of unique compared to every other theorist?
Yeah, so you had these thinkers in the 20th century, like Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann, who were a bit like the experts of their time in the sense that they thought that media could be used to sort of foster democracy in a somewhat vulgar way by coming up with kind of mechanisms of the noble lie, we could nearly say, forms of, let's say, nudging and guiding the public to be more conducive to sort of liberal democratic ideals. I'm not saying that like the intention of that is still remains in the 21st century as well, not just in the 20th century, but the capacity to really do that, I think, has been very much undermined. I think that these informational systems are so pervasive and so fast and so quick and so deworlding and so kind of totalizing and change so quickly that you can't really assume that there's a rational, even if a kind of Machiavellian and somewhat manipulative, that there's a rational, manipulative kind of leader at the top. And I think that in that sense, Virilio is distinct from theorists of the media on the left, like Noam Chomsky, for example, who is very much a critic of these 20th century kind of noble lie experts. Virilio's critique is much more radical than that. He's kind of describing an environment of perpetual fear, an environment of perpetual chaos, in which there's no rational leader. It's kind of more like tools which are turning on the tool user rather than the problem merely being a kind of bad tool user. It's the tool turning on the users of the tools. This is sort of how he distinguishes the 20th century from the 21st century. So one of his most important maxims, we could say, is that the 20th century was the era of the 20th and the 19th century was the era of the standardization of opinions. Media was designed to standardize opinions. The 21st century, it is designed to synchronize emotions. And this emotional synchronization, again, it's more environmental. We have less room for kind of rational distance from our opinions and our beliefs. They're more visceral. And which means there's less room for a disagreement, because I think in order to have disagreement, you do have to have some sort of rational detachment. And if we are emotionally synchronized and attuned in that way, in a much more intense and a much more volatile and a much more agitated kind of environmental phenomena, that means that there's much less room for disagreement and so forth. So his critique really centers around this shift to a synchronization of emotion. His critiques of this are also distinct from other theorists, I think mainly because the left has been the primary media critical voices in the 20th century, in the sense that he doesn't think the problem is, when you read Virilio, you don't get this kind of post-war critical theory vibe of everything is about understanding what the Nazis did, or maybe Stalin. And there's this kind of hyper-disciplinary, militaristic, totalitarian threat, which we all have to kind of become constantly aware of and avoid. His critique is quite the opposite, actually. Like, his critiques normally center around indiscipline, kind of emotionally synchronized masses that are just responsive to these tools they're using. They don't have a sort of input at all. They're not disciplined. They're not radicalized through, a love for the party and a desire to and a kind of nationalist desire to die for the nation and fight for the leader. They're very much more like, the danger which comes from them, and I think this is played out quite evidently, is that they sort of they're these sort of chaotic, hyper responsive, hyper emotionally volatile, hyper undisciplined kind of mass of people that are kind of synchronized in this informational structure. The threats to democracy thus come from indiscipline, chaos, an excessive indiscipline, an excessive consumption, an excessive chaos, rather than an excessive order, an excessive strength, and excessive discipline. So he's quite ahead of his time in noting the political threats in which media technologies push us into, which are much different in the 21st century than the 20th century. So I would say that is probably his how he is distinct. Yeah.
And just as a side note, I would definitely map that onto the idea that he does have a very, he recognizes the shift from the total wars of the 20th century to a pure war, which would be, a warfare that is conducted by way of cutouts and proxy and so on and so forth, all the way to the conflict of all against all thrust into the hypersphere of the internet, where seemingly all bets are off. It's not yet clear what sort of vectors some of this will take. So basically, if you had to sum it all up, I'll just ask quite bluntly, why study Virilio?
Yeah, one answer I will give will be to kind of echo what Giorgio Agamben said at the start of the COVID lockdowns, which was that we are now entering the end of bourgeois democracies. And I think this was probably pretty accurate. And I think Virilio is definitely in that category of thinkers. They're thinking through historically this end, as we were talking about earlier, the end of the standardization of opinion to the synchronization of emotion. This is also sort of a reflection of the end of bourgeois democracy into what do we have next? We're not really sure. Sort of tech feudalism or kind of digital capitalism or uh, whatever we want to call it, and whatever comes next is obviously still a question mark because things are unfolding. But he's basically trying to understand this historical moment, and he's trying to understand it, I think, through these categories of space, speed, emotional synchronization, catastrophes, and accidents, as you cover as well. So that's why he's important historically. I also think he's important because he's one of the few thinkers that have really taken space seriously and really looked into space in a very he's dedicated much of his life to thinking about space. As you were saying, he was also an architect and an urbanist, so he is always thinking about space and room and what we do with space, what we do with room, how we set things up. I would say he's very much a philosopher. When we're talking about speed, we're not just talking about speed; we're also talking about movement. So how things move, and we move around space, and so forth. So he's pushing philosophy, I think, to dive into space in a way in which it hasn't yet. And to echo Peter Sloterdijk, who's another contemporary philosopher who's done a lot of work on space. The 20th century, to make another kind of similar comparison, the 20th century was much more geared towards a philosophy of time. So Heidegger, for example, whereas as Sloterdijk argues, the 21st century will inevitably move towards more of a philosophy of space. And I would definitely think that Virilio's work is definitely echoes that fact. Now, just a few sort of contemporary crises which are relevant and we've gone through recently, which do reinforce this need to think about space in not just in a kind of scientific, but in a philosophical and a phenomenological manner. You have things like during the lockdowns, stay 2 meters away from each other, work from home. We have this sudden management of space. You can't travel this many distance. You can't travel 2 kilometers outside of your region or whatever. You have these idea now of like 15-minute cities, and you have pod life. This which is very much a spatial analogy of you live inside a pod and your relationship to the world is very virtual. The world moves around you. You don't move around it. So I think that there's an increasing urgency to think about space philosophically and phenomenologically. And Virilio kind of throws the ball to us in this regard. He's left for us a detailed account. Not everything is we don't have to agree with everything. We don't have to. He certainly hasn't covered every aspect of spatial philosophy, but he's definitely, I think, knocked the door down and showed us a new room of philosophical thought.
Hey, that's excellent. Many thanks. I thought there were some great insights there, and I really appreciated some of the angles you took on that, and very interesting. So at this point, I'd like to take the opportunity. We're going to flip the tables, and I'm going to allow you to sort of grill me on, some of my perspectives and where I'm coming from as it relates to Virilio. So I will happily hand over the reins of this whole operation.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, cheers. Thanks for those questions. That was really good. Okay, so first question is just the kind of obvious one. Why is Virilio important? Why should we study him?
So basically, as far as what's most important about Virilio's work, and on my view, I think that his analysis of the accident is basically is key, and it makes a lot of sense how he would arrive at this, beginning in the realm of speed and politics. Basically, as speed unfolds, heightened levels of acceleration and speed lend themselves towards accidents. And so Virilio's analysis of the accident is something that really it uncovers the hidden base of technical progress. And as a consequence of that, it disrupts the common interpretation and understanding that's given by the putative expert class. This is basically part of the constellation that Virilio calls the propaganda of progress, and which is something that we're basically bombarded with on a nonstop basis basically every day. Second, on my view, would be Virilio's analysis of extreme science, which is he defines as the science that threatens to put an end to all science put together, and which is basically instrumental in driving increasing anthropogenic catastrophe. And kind of following on that same pathway would be Virilio's predictions concerning endocolonization. So as opposed to like exocolonization, this would be technology going inside of the human body, which we've seen recently from somebody that I would describe as that lunatic RRE. And, basically the predictions pertaining to that, as well as sort of concerning, as you mentioned, polar inertia. So this would be the self-imposed immobilization of the body, culminating in pod life, and so on and so forth. And his reflections on this were made well in advance of COVID, with COVID itself something that would be seen as a technical progress accident based on interconnected logistics at the very minimum. And, here we have supply chains moving commodities around the world at an unprecedented pace. But at the same time, opening up the capacity for the transmission of pathogens, with the exact same rapidity. Virilio's analysis of the accident is, I think, crucial in this age of extreme technoscience, which is being accelerated at the cyclic rate by basically the most dominant personalities and powers on the contemporary scene. And therefore, Virilio's analysis of the accident and how it unfolds into all of these areas, such as substance, information, knowledge, aesthetics, and so on. This is where Virilio is at his best. So basically, given the internet as something of a new realm of transcendence, basically bringing together science and art, Virilio's analysis of aesthetics is, something that I think is far more relevant today than sort of a quotidian university class on art appreciation. And so by pointing out that our future hinges on a choice between ethics on the one hand and aesthetics on the other, and bearing all of that out, my claim is that Virilio's characterization of our predicament is unparalleled.
Yeah, fantastic. I think as you were mentioning, the extreme science aspect to Virilio, I think that's going to be really intriguing for people, because Virilio, he's not going to give you a detailed exposition of a particular component of extreme science, like he's not going to go into the details of genetic engineering, but it seems like he's giving you a kind of larger theory of technological innovation being kind of underwritten by catastrophes and accidents, right? So as he said, the shipwreck, and when you invent a ship, you invent a shipwreck, So I think that so that's definitely an area where Virilio is going to become more and more important, because that's something that we're going to be like. The 21st century, I think, is going to be just lots of extreme science experiments. It seems like that's already what's happening, especially with social engineering involved as well. Okay, so why do you think Virilio has been kind of left behind or somewhat neglected? Because I do feel like we've probably been the only people, one of the only people really on the internet, let alone the universities, to kind of go into this much detail about his work.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Virilio, he was embedded, right in the center of, the very highest thinkers in France during his era, where it was like the hottest, hypothetically, working for Derrida. He's cited in 1,000 plateaus. This is an incredibly influential work. I've heard that he actually may have taught a seminar with Foucault at a certain point in time. And so these are figures of real celebrity. And comparatively, Virilios Legacy, we could say that it's been in something of decline. There was only one other online course that I could even find on him. And even that was like difficult to ultimately gain access to. You couldn't just like click through immediately and, start getting after it. And but I do think there have been a few courses in the past, like, I don't know, 10, 15 years. One at Toronto, I was able to find, but very few altogether. At the same time, there is sort of a realm of Virilio studies. There's a Virilio dictionary, and I do know of people doing like master's degrees on Virilio and so forth. But altogether, he's seemingly been left behind. And my personal theory is that Virilio was left behind by the academic community more broadly, because his sort of revelations are realized to be a staunch indictment of the current trajectory of things, up to and including the university, the research ideal, and sort of, all of the above. And particularly an academic community that's increasingly complicit in extreme science, whether they want to be or not, techno capital, and also sort of increasing development of, let's say, post-humanism. And at the furthest extent, it would be like anti-human extremism. And so the claim would be, in an academy without conscience, in the service of an ethos that is basically tantamount to supreme nihilism, it would seem somewhat hypocritical to entertain some of what is suggested by Virilios' work. And then also, at the same time, he states this somewhere, and I found this somewhat fascinating. He's saying, hey, commercial society demands optimists. It seems like what's demanded is not just like some naive optimism. It's basically a naive optimism coupled with flattery. And so, because of the fact that Virilio refused to acquiesce to this sort of thing, I would say those are a couple of reasons for why he's been left behind. But I think it is imperative, if we're going to develop something in the way of collective self-awareness as well as preventative intelligence, that we try to reclaim some of the critical vectors that are explored in his work.
Yeah, I like preventative intelligence. Yeah, that was it. This seems to be what he's unique in, because his thinking is very much a kind of anticipatory thinking. I don't know if you've noticed this. Speed draws us closer to things. An accident which is kind of underwritten a certain innovative development or a kind of progress. And and I think that in that sense, he's also quite distinct from a lot of the university research centers and so forth, because they can't see the larger trajectory that they're moving in. And he's sort of constantly analyzing, dissecting, and critiquing it. So it makes sense that you don't have a lot of university systems, or even online, because there is a sort of, I think, and we're using the internet to make this course and communicate. So we're not above this technology or something, but even online, I think that within the kind of the online schools and the kind of influencer kind of sphere and the kind of online intellectual sphere, I think there tends to be a neglect of this blind spot, because we kind of have to be part of the extreme experiments, even to conduct ourselves, because we are using the technologies to teach this course that he's describing. So we sort of have to use the very world which he's critiquing in order to explain to people what he's talking about. So I think that it just leads to these contradictions, as you were saying, that like kind of, I'd say, dampen the mood whenever he's kind of brought up, right? But it's a kind of dampening, I think, that needs to be done. But and as well, it doesn't have to be a sort of dampening. It can be a realism it doesn't have to be a pessimism either, right? Like it doesn't have to be this kind of total fatalistic view. So just lastly, why should you take this course specifically? Not just learn about Virilio, but why should you take this course specifically?
Yeah, sure. I definitely think that both Virilio's analysis and its demonstrated predictive power are among the best of 20th century thinkers, all inclusive. And basically, he also makes a number of suggestions that aren't merely abstract, but that could be mapped onto actual political action. Ultimately, Virilio, he's one of the most original thinkers of both the recent period and for me, I think he's actually all time. And that his texts and manner of thinking are an essential corrective to many of our current errors. So if you're looking for perhaps the best diagnosis of the contemporary situation and possible preventative responses, then I would definitely consider studying Virilio. And we put together a free, like 12-page study guide on what text to read if you're looking to achieve like a good sense of his overall project. Link to that is in the description. I would definitely check that out. It's saying what texts are, the most accessible and like what parts of them to read in terms of like self-study. At the same time, one challenge is that since his work is so broad and interconnected, it can be difficult to really access it on the first pass. And so in the course, we're seeking to signpost all of the crucial corollaries to expedite that understanding. We're going to read some very narrowly tailored selections from crucial Virilio texts over 6 weeks. We're going to attempt to really penetrate what Virilio's driving at. Course materials, it includes over 5 hours of video lecture, which are also available independently. And ultimately, if you want to get an in-depth look at Virilio and his thought, our seminar sessions, they run for 6 weeks, and we'll hold 2-hour seminar every Saturday. This begins, we're starting on November 1st, and likely we'll take 1 week off for the holiday in the middle there in the US. Will be done by December 13th. And another aspect of these courses is the ability to, interact with others having similar interests, which is incidentally how Owen and I met in the first place in the digital semiosphere. And, basically, if you're interested in getting an overview of a thinker that is basically essential for our era, definitely recommend Virilio. And if you sign up prior to November 1st, we're offering a coupon code for $50 off the cost of the course. The code for that is SPEED. Take advantage of that as well. Is there anything that you would add to that, Owen?
Just to reiterate your point, 6 different components to this course are what we agreed were the 6 main themes in Virilio, and they're all they're seemingly very distinct and different. But once you start to connect them all together, it is quite illuminating. It's a quite expansive and illuminating process because it's incredible how this guy managed to take all of these separate parts and quite coherently sort of fuse them together with some, let's say, core logical arguments and observations. But it can really be worth your while. And I would also say that more than just being sort of scholars of Virilio, I think both in our own independent writings, we've sort of had Virillian themes. So for me, it's been kind of pod life, polar inertia, immobilization, this kind of spatial and phenomenological understandings. And you've written a book on critiquing academia. And obviously, academia is relevant here because we're talking about the research centers, the extreme science, and so on. The kind of ideological kind of churches of this propaganda of progress, as really would call it, and so forth. So yeah, so those are just a few more points on why you should take the course.
All right, that's excellent. Again, we're kicking off on November 1st. And so I'd just say if you're looking to get an overview of, in my opinion, one of the most essential thinkers of the 20th century if not the best. I would definitely recommend Virilio. If you sign up prior to November 1st, you can use the coupon code SPEED to get $50 off the cost of the seminar sessions. If you find his work to be half as insightful as I and many others have, chances are you'll be glad you did. Many thanks.